Oh, that's right. I should always remember I don't want to wear a white shirt. It kind of changes the perspective here. But so glad to have everybody here with us tonight and ready to do some Bible study. We're going to be looking in the book of First Timothy chapter 5. So I'd like to get a Bible out. Of course, I'll try to put the scriptures up as we go through them and study them. But so very good to have you all here. Try to do some Bible trivia. One of my problems is I can't remember always how to spell someone's name, and then I'm trying to rack my brain for some of the tougher ones because everybody gets them so quick that I struggle. But maybe there's some of you are thinking, I didn't know that somebody else had another name, so it's always kind of a surprise. I was thinking maybe might try some, my name was almost, like what was Benjamin's name almost, or what was John the Baptist's name almost. So we'll try that, something like that next time. I always appreciate everybody participating and throwing some thoughts out there. Get your Bibles out. We're going over to First Timothy chapter 5. That's where we're at today as we started talking last time. Just kind of a reminder where we were before. We were talking as Paul was telling Timothy how to treat and how to behave towards older men, older women, younger men, younger women. A lot of different important ideas there that you want to think about, including things like how should we, propriety towards younger women. It's an old preacher advice. You shouldn't be alone with a woman that would, younger or older, that would really be a good thing to consider. How to treat older men and older women like fathers, like mothers. All these things are important ideas that he needed to consider. Kind of pointed out, too, that this paralleled nicely to Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Titus and First Timothy are pretty close to being parallel books. They're both written to evangelists. They're both trying to get evangelists to help congregations get established. Certainly, Timothy has a lot more substance to it, but there's still follow a lot of similarities in there. So there's a lot of times where we'll look at a passage and we'll say, hey, I think that's something similar to what Paul is saying over in Titus. So that's not an unusual thing that we should find out. I want us to go ahead and get our move forward here, and we're going to be picking up here at verse 3. Let's go ahead and read verses 3 through 16 now of these passages, and talking about widows. And you've probably heard the expression from time to time, widows indeed. And that term comes from this passage, and we're going to be reading, and remember, First Timothy is all about the conduct and the work of the church. So as we're reading through this, understand that that is the fundamental idea that Paul is establishing with Timothy, how the church engages in a particular type of benevolent, taking care of people work. And that applies to, in this case, widows, those who are widows. So let's read together, beginning at verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. I'll scroll up just a moment. Well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And beside, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but gossips, busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary. Excuse me, I just lost my place there a second. They give no opportunity for the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. It's kind of interesting in this passage because Paul kind of wanders around a little more than typical. Paul's a fascinating writer, and a lot of times when he's describing his ideas, what he's doing is he does so categorically. But in this case, he's kind of moving a little bit in and around this subject. So we're going to kind of jump around so that we can be categorical in how we talk about these things. I want to go back up and consider that as Paul is talking here, verse 3 begins with this idea of the honor widows who are really widows. So this is a command for a church purpose. One of the purposes of the church is to take care of widows. Now, I always ask this, and I want to kind of plug it and get your answers here because I think you know it, but I want to see that you do. Why is there no corresponding passage to how orphans are to be taken care of by the church? Why is there no statement? Because we know that like in James 1:27, it says pure and undefiled religion before God is this, to take care of widows and orphans in their time of need. Now that's personal religion. He makes it clear, that's your personal application. Well, why is, and here we have something for the church to do in regards to widows, but why is there no passage in 1 Timothy or really anywhere in the New Testament that gives us directive on how the church is to take care of orphans? And I'd like you to answer that for me. Give me a thought about why that might be the case. I know we've talked about it before, but if you've got it, go ahead and throw it in the chat and we'll bring it up in just a moment. Some translations here at verse 3 say that we're honor widows who are really widows. And I mentioned earlier, sometimes translations will say widows indeed. And it's not really implying the idea that there are false widows, but it's talking about the idea of a qualification for a particular person who's going to be taken care of. So in other words, it's, the idea of elder. Elder just means an older person. It could be, anybody can be older, but in the text of the scriptures, what it's really talking about are those who are doing a specific office. I got a couple of comments, and they're just what I wanted. Individuals are to take care of are to take orphans and take care of them. That's exactly what I was looking for, Teresa. And Debbie says something similar. Orphans were taken in by family to be raised. The church doesn't have a purpose for orphans because it really isn't something the church can do. The church isn't really, I think all of us understand this. Orphans need homes with families. They don't need the church to provide for them. And so it's an important idea that we want to consider here that's part of this. Now, before Paul goes into the characteristics of taking care of widows, he plugs a really important idea, and he's going to hit it a couple of times. Verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now I want to jump up to verse 8, where he says something similar. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now I want to jump up one more time, verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Again, that really might throw you off a little bit because you might think, well, what do they mean? But in that case, what they mean is women who, again, meet specific qualifications, and that's the important point. Lamar throws one more comment about that. Lamar says the family unit is primarily responsible for orphans. And Lamar adds to that an important point, and widows. And that's right. Here, the full qualifications of widows that may be supported by the church are detailed. So again, you guys all picked up exactly what I wanted you to see. That the reason we don't have a passage about, how the church is to take care of orphans is that there's no, that's simply not something the church could be characterized to do. Orphans are taken care of by people. That's the work that all of us have. And I always commend those who in particular have reached out in their homes and accomplished that work. That's an important work, a very important work to consider. So stepping back up to those passages again about that kind of detail the idea that first of all, widows are taken care of by families. And Lamar kind of detailed that point, and I want to kind of visit that idea just for a second to think about this. What we're really talking about here is the idea of, he uses the word piety, verse 4. Let them first show piety at home and repay their parents. I've always liked this term, repay their parents. I like it because it's really important to understand that it's it's not so much the idea that, we're being burdened by this, but instead that we're giving back something that has been given to us. I put a note there for you out of Matthew 15, because there Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees for some of their things about this. In fact, I'll tell you what, we'll just take a look at this for a second. In Matthew 15, verse 4, Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees. He says, God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother. He who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. You say, again, he's talking to the Pharisees and what they do wrong. You say, whoever says to his father or mother, what profit you might have received from me as a gift of God, then he need not honor his father and mother. Thus you've made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Now, I just want to make a point here out of that passage, that passage is telling us that the command to honor your father and mother is accomplished by adults who are taking care of their parents. This is an important thing for us to consider. I know I kind of tease my kids a lot about it, saying, you better be ready to take care of me. I'm gonna have high standards to be taken care of. And I see my parents online tonight, and I've warned them about the low standards. I'll take care of them. I'm just teasing, of course. But it's important that we understand this is a very, very important requirement for Christians, that we take care of our family. Now, by the way, what I think is really interesting is that in this passage, it doesn't just throw parents and children as the relationship. Notice what it says there in verse 4. It also includes grandchildren. That grandchildren, if we're Christians, we have an obligation to take care of grandparents. So this is something really important. Verse 8 talks about somebody just in your household. So again, that could even be a broad statement about who that could be. So it's not just parents that this obligation is about. This is important. I know a lot of times when people talk about these things, and I'll hear people say, well, I don't want to be a burden to my kids, but this is how they fulfill the law of Christ. And it's important to understand that this is something that we're obligated to do that demonstrates piety. And that's an important idea for us to consider. Piety is established in this sense. Now, not just the idea that piety is established, but then there's a warning, verse 8, which says if somebody doesn't provide for their own, and I've always thought this is a profound statement. They say he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's a really profound statement, right? If you're not taking care of your family, and like I said, he'd taken care of his own and those of his household, that's a pretty broad statement. I mean, it can be a lot of people put into that category. And the point is, if you're not accomplishing that work, he says, you've denied your faith. The concepts of the faith in Christ are that we have this important characteristic of care, and if you're not doing it, you've denied your faith. That's pretty serious. You're worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty serious. Now, we'll just kind of footnote here and say that this is one of those moments where we need to appreciate and understand God doesn't really say that there's a qualification here that parents need to have to be taken care of by their children. They don't have to say, well, if your parents did X, Y, Z, then you can take care of them. And if they didn't, that's in fact what Jesus was getting upset with about the Pharisees, who said, well, I've taken the money that I take care of you with and I dedicated it to God. By the way, that passage doesn't say that they were doing that like dishonestly. The whole point is that they had a tradition about dedicating something to God, and Jesus was rebuking them for the fact that they, were not taking care of their parents. My point is, maybe they really believed they were doing something good, but they absolutely were not. And that's a really important idea for us to think about here. This is something really important. If you don't take care of your own, he says, you're worse than an unbeliever. Now, there's one more point I want to make here, and that's that last statement that I just went back to. Verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, and again, it's a broad discretion. Man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. Do not let the church be burdened, that they may relieve those who are really widows. And again, just think maybe of the idea of their need is genuine. What kind of concepts does this remind or tell us about the work of the church? And this is sometimes I use this passage because I would suggest that this is actually a really important idea as far as, the characteristic of a lot of the works of the church. What does this passage say, this verse 16, where it says, don't let me throw it up here for a second for you to see there at the bottom there. If any believing man or woman has widows, let him relieve them. Do not let the church be burdened. What principle or idea can you see there that we need to understand, maybe in even a generic way, about the relationship of the things that the church accomplishes versus the things that a individual Christian accomplishes? I realize that sometimes my questions are just kind of leading and I'm trying to get a specific answer, but I'm kind of hoping maybe you kind of pick out what I'm trying to say here. What idea is it that we want to get in general about the characteristic or the relationship of a church and its work and the individual Christian and their work? Because those works overlap a lot, right? The church can do evangelism. Well, I can personally do evangelism. The church can do edification. It can edify, and I can edify. And lots of things that the church does and I do overlap. And some things don't overlap, by the way. Whenever we talk about the idea of me helping people that aren't Christians, there's nothing that the church has like that. There's me entertaining things or doing things for a social activity. I have the authority to do that, but that's not something the church does. But what idea can you see here? What principle can you see that's stated with this expression, do not let the church be burdened, that maybe, as I said, applies to any of the overlap where the church and the individual Christian both have a purpose to do? Can you kind of get the point of what that might be, how that might apply to, say, evangelism or edification or any benevolence? What might be the idea that you want to consider there that's really, really important? It is something that I think is worth thinking about for a moment as we kind of consider this idea, the statement here. Well, George kind of really drives home a point that we want to think about. George says, well, the church must have authority for everything it does. Now, that is such an important idea of what we're talking about here, and the idea of the church's authority to do things. The church has to have an authority to do things, and oftentimes it's more specific even, and I say that carefully. It's not more specific based on the type of authority, but because of the way the authority is revealed, that oftentimes we understand the church has a very limited authority. Lamar says this. Lamar says, verse 16 means that we are all to carry out the compassionate love seen in Christ to our families as well as our brethren. Individual responsibility. So this is where we're headed with this. And Wendy is kind of also picking up the other side of this point. If the church's responsibility to always take care of everything, then the focus would be constantly needing to raise money. So what does that imply? Well, it implies the idea that the church isn't designed to be the first responder in most works. Do we understand that? Teresa adds this: the church is only obligated to do those things God has allowed us to do as a congregation versus individual responsibility. Individual responsibility is what we're talking about here, but I want to imply this. Let's say, for example, your neighbor says, hey, I'd sure like to hear more about the Bible. And you say, well, wait a second, I've got to go talk to the church and see if they can come together and take care of this need first. No, you need to take care of that need because you have the ability to do so. Somebody, you're one of the brethren calls and says, hey, can you come help me? I'm having a problem, and you can help them. You have the ability to help them. Nope, sorry. Let's go to the church first and let the church help first. Well, that's not going to work, is it? You are the first line as an individual Christian in everything, in evangelism, in benevolence, in edification. The church, in a sense, is secondary in all of these things. So just as the church is really secondary after, the benevolence in the home, the church is secondary in evangelism. You're the primary method of evangelism. You're the primary method of edification. You're the primary method of taking care of one another. In fact, you're going to be judged by that. The church isn't going to find that kind of judgment. It doesn't really have that kind of judgment, but you will. A couple more comments here. Stephen Root throws out here, he says, supporting orphans is not within the jurisdiction of the church. The church isn't a social organization. You guys are hitting the right ideas here. This is good stuff. Stan, Let me grab this real quick, just for a second. Stan says, Jesus said before that he knows to do good and does not do it, that he who knows to do good, I think it was James who said this, he who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. I think that's the book of James, I think is what Stan meant. Each of us knows things that are that not all know these needs. Some have come to my need without being said. Stan's right. So Stan has the point that sometimes, the individual Christian in the moment is always better equipped than the church. I say always, that's not true. But often, the Christian in the moment is better equipped to carry out the purpose than the church is in general. Teresa says Christians are first responders. And then she goes on to point to James 1:27, which is the individual command. Teresa's right. James 1:27 says pure and undefiled religion before God. He describes it as two things: taking care of widow and orphans and keeping oneself, there's the personal relationship or the personal religion there, keeping oneself unspotted from the world. So you guys are picking it up, and I appreciate this. The big idea here is that it's not the church that's meant to be the first line of accomplishing God's great works. The Bible says that you and I personally are created in Christ to accomplish good works that Christ has set up beforehand. That's Ephesians chapter 2. So you guys picked up the point I want us to see. And why is this significant? Because too often people kind of get it backwards, and they see that the works need to first come through the church. And I would say in particular, sometimes we use that term institutional to describe those brethren who have set the church up as that first responder, so to speak, and then they create all sorts of organizations, and like Wendy said, pretty soon they simply don't have enough money to get these things done. So the big idea here then is that that simply isn't the way that it's meant to be done. You and I are meant to be the first responders. I really like that term there. Lisa goes on. Lisa goes on to say, we as individuals are given so much opportunity to provide for ourselves and our families that it makes it difficult to provide an actual reason as to why one would need a system. That's very true. Lisa, in fact, what you're kind of bringing up is kind of an unusual thing to think about. And I tell you what, Lisa, I'm going to come back to what you said here in just a few moments when we talk about widows in need and just how different that was in the first century versus the 21st century. And it really kind of fits to what your comment here is. So I appreciate that. You go on to say saving the church's resources for serious needs is important. And that's right. That's right. But this is one of those reasons where we say, whenever we give, on the first day of every week, understand that if you're the first line of giving, not the church, and that you need to make sure that even if you're supposed to fulfill this command to lay something aside, but you're also setting aside in your mind, or at least you're purposing that what you have, you're also using to help others outside of the church opportunities. So that's an important thing to think about. And in fact, Teresa kind of goes on to say this. Teresa says, I've heard Christians say, I give money to the church for them to use for these things, which means they do not understand this concept. Right on, Teresa. That's a great comment. In fact, Teresa, frankly, that's the mind that I'm thinking about when I'm trying to say what we need to appreciate is that while we are giving to the church, and Lisa kind of said it's, the church's resources are saved for other things or saved for more serious things, in the end, fundamentally, we're all supposed to be the first one to do this because this is what's going to get us to heaven, right? Matthew 25, when you saw me and I was hungry, you gave me food, you gave me clothing. Jesus describing on the day of judgment who he's letting in to the eternal rest. And it's people who serve other people who are consistently using the blessings they have in order to help others. So it's really important. It's important, and I think a couple of comments have been made. Stan made a good one about this, that a lot of times, people, just a small part of their giving is found in the collection basket at church. The greater part of their giving is in their time and effort to help others. And that's the greater point of what we're going to be judged for. So that's really a great a great way of considering this. And I apologize that sometimes I'm just kind of working around an idea, trying to get something out. But you guys, you hammered it. You got just what I wanted to say. You're the first line. But as I said, not just benevolence, of evangelism. The church doesn't have your neighbor. You have your neighbor. You have opportunities. And it's important that we understand that to edification, to give those good words to others that encourage them or lift them up, that's you. You're the most effective worker to that purpose. And we all ought to think of ourselves this way. It's not that we turn to the church to do these things. It's that we ourselves do these things. And yeah, sometimes these things are bigger than us and we use the church to accomplish it. But in the end, we are the personal workers of God. And that's an important idea for us to think about as we consider this. The family is meant to be the first line of support for benevolence. And this is an important idea. Well, let's kind of step back and talk about this passage where it goes. Let me jump back here, where it goes on to talk about the idea of those who are to receive this aid from the church. Those that are here, it says really widows. Like I said, I hope that's not confusing. But those who are really widows. Now, he says that this is somebody, verse 5, who is left alone. So, you got a sense that they're not, they don't have anybody. They trust in God. They continue in supplication and prayers night and day. Verse 9, we jump ahead again. Don't let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she's been the wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she has brought up children, she's lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. So here are these characteristics, these qualifications that we have, that we consider here for those who are supported. Lamar's comment, he says, this section on widows includes at least 7 qualifications for the one to be supported by the church, which is an example to us, for us, about the individual responsibility. Very good, Lamar. So let's kind of look at these things for a moment. Those who are widows, and I used the term widows indeed, or that's, as I said, some verses use there, some translations use that term. The qualifications are, they had to be, number 1, 60 years or older. Number 2, the wife of one man. Now, by the way, that's kind of an interesting point because it's the exact same wording that was used back in 1 Timothy 3 when it said the elder is to be the husband of one wife. It's the same terminology that the widow is to be the wife of one husband. So it's kind of an important or an interesting observation. This is somebody who is reported on for their good works. In other words, they're known well for the good works they've done. This is somebody who has brought up children. This is somebody who has shown hospitality to others. This is somebody who has, and here's an interesting expression, washed the saints' feet. You got a thought about wash the saints' feet? Throw that in the chat. I'd like to hear some of your observations about that and kind of explain that. If I didn't understand what that meant, I'd sure like to have you explain that to me. And then it states that this is somebody who has relieved the afflicted. I took out one of these, diligently followed every good work. It seems to me that last statement just kind of says, and, basically is, does every good work. There's nothing that they've left lacking. So as I said, you got an idea on washing the saints' feet, throw that out there. But let's kind of dwell on these for just a couple of moments. And first of all, let's say, how is it that we see these very specific qualifications carried out? I guess maybe what I'm kind of asking here is the idea that, I think the first question I would have is, well, what if somebody's a widow and they didn't have children? What if somebody's a widow and then they got married and then they were widowed again? What do all these things specify? And what's the easy answer to that? There is an easy answer to that. Is if somebody says, what about? You know the answer. The answer is, well, they're not the person that the church is talking about. So what exactly is this then? And that kind of is an important idea. Lisa makes a statement. She says, Romans 15 verses 1 and 2 refers to bearing each other's burdens. So Lisa, what's interesting here is the idea that we're to be taking care of each other. I was thinking of Galatians 6 and verse 2 as well, Lisa, about that. So Teresa kind of gives us a point on that, the same thought that Lisa does. What does it mean to wash the saints' feet, bearing each other's burdens, serving each other's needs on a personal basis? All these are good things. We understand in ancient times, if you're a traveler, you'd come to somebody's home and it'd be very often they might have somebody wash your feet. It's a very personal act. It's a little bit humiliating, you might say. Remember how Peter reacted when Jesus went to wash his feet. But the point is, it's an act of it's an act of kindness to somebody who it might fit nicely with the hospitality. Anthony says, washing the saints' feet reminds me of what Jesus did. It's having the heart of a servant. I like that, Anthony. Again, taking us over to John chapter 13. John chapter 13, where Jesus did that. Very good. Debbie Root says washing the saints' feet was a basic need of hospitality in that day. Today, we might offer food or drink. And I like that, Debbie, because you're giving us what would that look like today? And I think you're right. I think that's exactly what that might look like. Stephen Root says, what would be the cultural equivalent for washing the feet, as hospitality is already listed? And Stephen, that is interesting because it is kind of linked up with hospitality. And so all I can say is I think it is the idea of not just opening your home, hospitality, but actually offering the convenience, the opportunity for conveniences to somebody that would be equivalent to this. So it's an interesting observation. Lamar says, washing the saints' feet is similar to what Christ did to the disciples. It shows the heart, humble servant's heart. I was thinking, did I already read that? No, it's just exactly what Anthony was saying too. That's really neat. You guys both saw this. Stan has an observation about the one-woman man. Only one in her life. She's a widow, no husband now. Important point to consider about that, Stan. Very good. Teresa says, just like with other things with qualifications, they have to meet all of these to be supported by the church. That kind of goes back to the question I said a moment ago. If somebody's 59, if they didn't have kids, well, the answer is then they're not on this roll. Now, the second question is, well, does that mean they don't get any help at all? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. Maybe you have a thought about that. I think probably you already know some of the answer to that. But, Lisa's comment. Lisa says, showing that no one is better than the other. It's kind of interesting. It is as I said, a very humbling experience. And two people already talked about the servant's heart and the humility of the servant's heart. And Stan says, as an individual to help this person. So it really does speak to what we're personally doing. And I think Stan's answer there is actually kind of speaking a little bit to what about the person that doesn't meet these qualifications. We'll come back to that in a second. Stan takes us over to Luke 2, verses 36 and 37. And he's talking there about Anna, who served in the temple after she became a widow. Now, she's interesting because she became a widow very young, the Bible says. So I think that statement's always kind of confusing there about Anna. But, it's interesting that she then dedicated herself to serving in the temple. So what about those? And what would this, what about those that were... as I said, maybe they didn't quite fit these circumstances, What would that be like? Well, one thing to consider is that what we're talking about here is a kind of assistance that isn't just the idea of reaching out. In fact, what we would say is the term used here is they're not to be put on the roll. Well, what do you think that means when he says that they're not to be put on the roll? I think that's an interesting, important idea. Verse 9 is where you find that. I know in the New King James it says, taken into the number. And when you look at that term, taken into the number in verse 9, and as I said, some translations will use the term put on the roll. Let me see if that's the... put on the list is how the New American Standard says, and I think that King James might say the roll. What does that mean? And how does that kind of help us to understand those widows that might not qualify to this? Teresa makes this statement, and Teresa's answering the question. She says, not a permanent solution where they're taken care of on an ongoing basis. So, in other words, what Teresa is saying is that somebody who is a widow and who has a need can be helped by the church, but they're not taken on in this permanent way. Stephen talks about supported by the church and its treasury. Let's understand that what we're really talking about here is almost like I'm going to be careful how I say it, almost like a retirement. And in other words, one of the important ideas of the church is that these women that meet these specific qualifications are to be taken care of long-term by the church. Now, the church can help any member. We see that in the New Testament. It can offer to help any member with a need that the member has. But the idea of somebody being committed to a role, to a long-term, may I say, indefinite type of assistance, well, that is going to be those who fit this unique qualification. And to that end, kind of going back and saying this, kind of what Lisa said, why not today? Well, for one, just about, our society actually has a lot of provisions for widows that may take place first. Remember, the church isn't the first place that this goes, but further on down. Now, kind of an important question. When I ask you about the role, what's that kind of talking about? Maybe another way of asking this is to ask, where else in the Bible do you read about widows on a roll? Widows on a Roll. Boy, I'd watch that movie. Widows on a Roll. No, widows who have been put on this list. Where else in the New Testament do we find widows who have been put on a list of some kind? A daily allotment, if you would. Where else do you find that? Do you guys remember? Because that'll kind of help us to see that this is something a little different than just the church helping one time. Stephen's got it. Stephen's takes us back to the book of Acts. Let me go to that. Acts chapter 6. Monique's got it too. In those days, there's a number of disciples who are multiplying, and there rose a complaint against the Hebrews. I prefer that when they say the native Jews by the Hellenists, the Greek Jews, because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. There's that statement, and this is in the church of the work of the church taking care of widows, and this work was a daily distribution. Now, verse 2, what does that kind of tell us about what this distribution was? It's kind of interesting there. Verse 2, he makes the point that we're not here to serve tables. You know, I seem to recall that the word there in Greek, I didn't double check this, so maybe I'll be careful to say it, but I think it just literally meant serve food. But the idea is that they were being brought something every single day, and that became a work of, verses 3 and 4 and 5, the 7 men that were selected that sometimes we describe as deacons. Again, making it very clear that this was a permanent, long-term thing that required the creation or brought us to the point where we saw a creation of those, can I use the word proto-deacons? They're not quite exactly deacons, but they're kind of deacons. And it might tell us one of the things that deacons are doing, that they're making sure that this important work, the work of taking care of the widows, is being accomplished. So what does all this mean? Well, the big idea here is that, widows can be taken care of if they don't qualified. The church can help them, but the idea of being in this long-term support, the only person that there's a sense in the entire New Testament church that has this long-term benevolent support is for those who are qualified as widows indeed. A couple other comments here. Lamar makes the statement, the role or list could be a special church responsibility for a time, not intended to be permanent. Lamar, it could be. I kind of think it might be permanent only because of these specific qualifications. But Lamar, I have to admit, that's just an inference on my part, and certainly not a necessary one. The reason I see it that way is you met these specific qualifications to receive this assistance, but the church is authorized to help any member for a short time. So I'm taking that there's a distinction here between specifically the amount of time that you're able to help. Stan makes the statement, emergency situations, we help whenever the need is just short time. It may be that members will need to step up, and Stan goes up to point out how this happened on the day after Pentecost. So that's a really important point to consider too. So all that being said, here we have this sense of the importance. And by the way, don't you get a great sense of just how important widows are to the church? how important their work is to the church. And think about it. The fact is that he's described here those who are doing something really important. Look at verse 5. They trust in God. They continue in supplications and prayer night and day. These are people who are doing important things for the church. So, it's not as though they're just receiving this without any expectation. They've well earned this care. And that's an important idea for us to consider. Anybody has any other comments, throw them out there and we'll grab it. But we'll kind of pick up here and move on a little further as we talk about these things. Let's kind of go to this point, though, where he's denying those who might have been widows, but he states aren't quite qualified for this by their age. So in verse 6, verse 6 really isn't touching to that. It talks about those who live in pleasure, aren't doing what's right, and that's to the widows who might have been qualified. They're not qualified. But let's look at this in picking up here at verse 11. Refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. Besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. He then goes on to say, I desire the younger widows to marry, to bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the adversary to speak reproachfully. This is kind of an interesting statement, and I would say, I don't think anybody probably disagree, that there's a universal truth here to men and to women about the great danger of not having something to do. Look at the term, the warning about being idle. It's mentioned twice in verse 13. You ever heard the expression, idle hands are the devil's workshop? The idea is that if we don't have something to occupy our time, we tend to allow ourselves to do things that are ungodly. As he goes on to talk about being gossip and busybody, those aren't characteristics unique to women. Those are characteristics for anybody, particularly anybody who, as Paul has been describing here, doesn't have, just doesn't have enough to do. Lisa remembered idle hands, the devil's play toy. So again, we understand that that's a principle we're familiar with. And here is Paul describing this idea of being idle, being such a dangerous thing. And as I said, the characteristics here, wandering from house to house, being a gossip, busybody, saying things you shouldn't say, those are characteristics of anybody who just has too much time on their hands. So Paul's warning here is saying, younger widows, the danger that's represented to them is that, they're going to take it in by the church. That's not going to do them good. He says what they ought to do instead is to marry, to bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the devil to speak. And that's something that we ought to consider. How important it is that we find things to occupy, to do, work to do, that it's important for all of us to understand there's a great danger that without things to do, we don't allow ourselves to do what's right. That term, I was just thinking here for a second, that term manage the house is kind of interesting. Manage the house implies the idea of being the head of the house. It's kind of an unusual term. We don't often think of that as the description of women in the Bible, but that's what the term means here as he describes these things. It's kind of interesting. Has anybody got any other comments? We'll take them, but really we've come just about to our time here, and I hate to pick up too much more after this. We've really kind of covered these things as far as I would like to. I don't want to pick up at the next point. So as I said, if you've got another comment there, I'll grab it. Otherwise, 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 16 is described for us the characteristics of those who are to be taken in by the church, very specific. Sometimes I've brought this passage out as a point to those who, churches that support institutions for taking care of people, retirement homes and the like. I recall years ago I got a flyer for a request for the congregation I was in to send money to this charitable home to take care of people. And I sent them back 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. I said, the first thing I'd want to know, and there's a lot more about it than this. do you follow these requirements? Well, they never got back with me. And the point is they didn't. They obviously didn't. And typically, most churches that are institutional and set up institutions to take care of the elderly, they're not following any kind of biblical principles or patterns to do so. And that's an important thing for us to consider. A couple of good points here. Teresa says, this reminds me of Naomi being taken care of by Ruth, her daughter-in-law. Yes, that's a great point. That's a really important point because that's a great example of the kind of person we're supposed to be. Not Ruth wasn't her daughter, but she was her daughter-in-law, and she was diligent to take care of her. In fact, when Boaz saw her, he says, that's the thing I like, because everybody's heard about how you've taken care of your mother-in-law. That's a neat point. Grant says, in a culture where most people expect not to work after a certain age, we should probably try to devote ourselves even more to serving the church after we retire. Yes, very important. I think it's a terrible thing that so many people have a plan, something you call it the American dream, of retiring and doing nothing but enjoying yourself. I'm very mindful of the parable that Jesus gave us of the man who, when he spoke about retiring, God said, "You fool, this night your life will be taken from you." I think it's a dangerous thing to try to pursue that dream of doing nothing. Dangerous for a lot of reasons. That's a really good point, Grant. And it's kind of interesting. Lamar makes the point to say verse 14 is giving direction for what younger widows need to do. And, it's pretty clear: to marry, to have children, to manage a home, and giving no opportunity for the adversary to speak. Those are all great comments. So we're bringing ourselves to a close here. Appreciate everybody's really good comments today and the thoughts we had. And next week, we're going to continue on in the rest of this chapter, talking a little bit about elders. How does the preacher deal with elders? And what happens when elders sin? How is that supposed to be handled? Well, those are the things we're going to be talking about next time we come back together. Thanks for all the great comments and observations we had today, and God bless you in this new week.